Hi, and welcome to Coming to Terms with AI. I'm Miri Bleicher, the social media manager at Coco Hub. I had absolutely zero knowledge when it comes to conversational AI, chatbots, and voice bots. I need help. So I decided to create a glossary of terms even a newbie like myself could understand. I'll be asking industry leaders to explain terms, ideas, and concepts in the field in a way that will make sense to me. And if it makes sense to me, there's a good chance it will make sense to you. So today, I turn to Rebecca Evanhoe and Diana Dybel, co-authors of Conversation with Things, coming up this spring. Hi, everyone.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So can you tell me what are slots and entities?
We're already laughing because when we were deciding what to use, the terminology to use in our book, we started digging into slot versus entity and whether these terms are the same thing or whether they have different definitions. And we discovered that, Diana, if you want to hop in and...
Yeah, across the industry, this is kind of, I think, a hotter topic than we anticipated. Everybody has an opinion, so I'm sure whatever we say here is going to be heavily debated. But the way that and certainly the way that I've always taken it is slot is one thing, entity is another thing, and they are separate. They are related to one another, but they are not the same thing. Again, this can be and often is debated in the industry. The way that I typically think about it is when you're designing for, again, parameters is like another way somebody might frame this, but when you're trying to elicit information from a user that you need in order to move the conversation forward successfully, something like if you are trying to see if they want to order a t-shirt, you might need to know what size the t-shirt is in order to move forward. So the slot would be the area in which you are trying to capture the information, and the entity is the information that could go into that particular slot. So in this instance, shirt size might be the slot, and the entities might be things like small, medium, large, extra large. But of course, entity, as Rebecca did a little bit more research on this side, has some linguistic implications.
Yeah, so the amazing thing was, like, I've tried to research this 3 times, and a lot of people said what Diana said, which is the slot, what is it? The slot is the parking spot, and the entity is the car, the different cars that can go into the parking spot. A lot of people said that. And then I started looking into, like, there's Google's documentation for building actions, and then there's Alexa's documentation for building skills. And in those, it seems like the Alexa terms are using slot and slot values for this concept. So the slot is the parking spot, and the slot values are the cars that can go in it. And it seems like Google is using entity and entity value for that same concept. But then we started asking people who have like 20, 30 years of conversation design experience. Linguists seem to use it really differently than everybody else. So most of the linguists I talked to were like, no, those aren't the same thing. Entity can kind of, is it in linguistics outside of conversation design, is like a word that's used to refer to, like, I don't know, sets of objects or something. Every single linguist I asked said they're not the same thing, but gave me a different answer as to why. So there's just a ton of variation. And in our book, we decided to use the term slot and slot value. I think because we used it in a very specific way, which is the way Diana described. So it's like when you have an utterance, like, I want to order a small t-shirt, the slot is the t-shirt size. You in your utterance put in the slot instead of writing out an utterance for each value. So instead of saying, I want to order a small t-shirt, I want to order a medium t-shirt, you put in the slot, and the slot stands in for all those variables. And that's how we use it in our book, because we expand on that concept a lot. And slot sort of seems a little more intuitive than entity. So that's what we went with.
Yeah, I think I was on the fence because I've always used entity and entity with slot, which is, I'm sure, probably making somebody pull their hair out at this point somewhere. But the slot value, it took me a minute to get on board with it, only because the word value has always been a bit vague and confusing. I think for people, there are a lot of people in the industry that come from writing backgrounds, which is how Rebecca and I both came to conversation design. And if you have a brain that's very much like language oriented, or just more on that side of the brain, the word value can be triggering is a strong way of phrasing it, but there's like this mathematical implication to it that can kind of shut off the brain a little bit of like, oh my God, there's math involved in this all of a sudden. And I'm certainly like, that has been my reaction to it. And entity was like a far more like, again, like Rebecca mentioned, linguistic word, which is imbued with like a lot more history and problems for that reason, but it connected with me. And so I was like, oh, I get this. And I just like intuitively used that, right or wrong. But yeah, as we were writing through this and trying to connect the dots, it felt like, at least for us, referring to it as a slot and a slot value was the clearest way to actually connect the two together in the most simple and plain language.
Wow.
Yeah, and we made a point to mention in our book, the most important thing is to use the language that your team is using. And I tell this to my students in my conversation design class too. I just said, like, when you go to get a job as a conversation designer, you need to know there's different ways to refer to this stuff, and just find out what language your team is using and go with that. So it's more important that the team has shared language than that there's some universal standard.
Well, it's first of all, it's really cool, the parking spot and the car goes into that's a very simple way to grasp it. And it's so interesting that there are so many terms in conversation design that are kind of, I don't want to say interchangeable, but people use them in so many different ways. Why do you think that is?
I mean, part of it's probably just like, this is not a new field by any means. Like Rebecca said, there's been people working this for 20, 30 years and longer. But the sort of rise in popularity and demand for designers and developers in this field, it has increased a lot over the last 10, 15 years. And I think for that reason, because things are just cropping up sort of quickly and a bit organically, there hasn't really been a standardized way of doing it, because everything's just been like a handful of people who know this really, really well and have worked amongst themselves for a while. And now that there's more people are just sort of like inventing things, and that is great on one side. And then on the other side, you end up with this sort of Wild West situation of like, how do we call this? How do we document this? And it's kind of a free for all.
Yeah, I do think that part of it is too, so many people come into the field with different backgrounds. So there's linguists, there's people who are data scientists and experts in natural language processing from like a technical side, developers, people with writing backgrounds, people with psychology backgrounds. So I think that lends itself also like the word entity to someone who's a developer and someone who's a linguist have been using that term in their own fields. And so when it comes together, there's sort of different connotations that people bring.
If you had to choose, what would be like the definition for everyone? Would you use the one you had used in the book?
I would. I think that's why we picked it.
I like the one we use in the book. And we explain in there, here's why we're using this term. I don't know. I like, it could be an interesting opportunity for a totally new word. Like if we all started calling it a whole or something, you know, like if there was a brand new word, just like reset it, that could be pretty interesting too.
Amazing. Well, thank you. Thank you for the explanation and the philosophy behind it.
I also want to give a quick shout out. Since you called out the parking lot metaphor, that we can't take credit for that. That was my husband, who is also a designer, but he's a visual designer. And I was trying to explain slots and slot values to him. And he's like, oh, so it's like, so that's all Jeff Dybel, not us.
Absolutely.
Thank you for being on the show, and for you guys out there, tune in for the next one. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.